that works to close the disability employment gap here in the UK. We do that sort of two ways. So first of all, we support disabled and chronically ill professionals all across the UK with training, with mentorship, with career clinics, and actually really exciting news. We've actually recently secured some funding to develop actually an e-learning resource for disabled, chronically ill job seekers, and also people that are currently looking to switch careers. A bit about me, I was born with a variety of respiratory issues, and that's meant that I spent my life on a lot of immunosuppressing drugs. So, for example, I was actually shielding during the pandemic. I also have ADHD, and like a lot of women, I was diagnosed a bit later in life, which is quite common with neurodiversity in women. I work to empower sort of disabled people through training and mentorship, and I work with businesses to help them with inclusivity and access best practice. Next slide. So a little bit about how we work at SICK. It's very much a sort of circular solution. So kind of starting up with our learning hub. So we provide sort of talented professionals with low levels of employment, with access to training, access to tailored resources, help them to sort of expand their professional network. We then provide sort of like one-to-one mentorship, paid internships to get real world work experience. And then we also work with the businesses that are actually going to sort of employ those people. So there are massive hiring and talent shortages currently in the UK. About 84% of businesses are currently experiencing a talent shortage. And this is really a way of tapping into new markets. One of the key things, you know, with diversity and inclusion as a whole is that, you know, actually the most diverse workforces actually create the most innovation globally. That's a big source of income for us, which then means that we can provide the disabled community with the services that we provide. Next slide. So in terms of this workshop, it's going to be pretty interactive. I'm going to sort of run through things as briefly as possible to sort of allow everybody to ask questions. So we're going to start off talking about sort of disability in the here and now, then covering off how to appeal to disabled talent, and then looking at sort of retention of disabled employees, and then just some really quick inclusive marketing wins that we can all make. Next slide. So, disability in the here and now. It might actually surprise you that 1 in 5 of the working age population are disabled. And actually, when we consider chronic illness in that, that figure is actually 33% of the working age population. However, 47% of disabled people are currently unemployed. So that's 10% of the working age population that are currently unemployed and seeking work. UK businesses are losing out on £274 billion per year by not considering disabled people. So that's actually something called the purple pound. Might not be something that you've heard of before, but there's a really, really interesting resource available online all about the purple pound, and actually how really simple changes that businesses can make can hugely boost their profits. And basically we kind of at SICK, we exist to kind of connect the dots between sort of talent short organisations and talented disabled professionals. I realise there I've put the same bullet point twice, but it's still very, very important. Next slide. So just to kind of understand how disability kind of works in terms of different models. So the medical model, that's something that we have kind of grown up with in the UK, and that's kind of viewing disability as a problem of the person, sort of directly caused by disease or trauma or health condition. And that's something that as an organisation and as a wider disabled community, we're really trying to move away from. So the social model is actually an idea that is becoming much more recognised, and basically taking that disability is not an attribute of an individual, but is actually something that's created by the social environment. So say, for example, somebody is in a wheelchair and they live in a house that has been completely adapted to their needs. At home, they aren't disabled, but when they go to, say, a cafe or a restaurant which has a step, then they are immediately disabled because they are unable to access that building. Then there are a few other kind of quite interesting models. So there's the identity model, which is where somebody claims disability as a positive identity, and that's absolutely something that I really advocate for personally, as somebody that has kind of really had to grow into my identity as a disabled person. There's the minority model, which is the experience of disabled people being similar to other protected characteristics. And there's the tragedy model, which is basically kind of that idea that we are simply kind of deserving of pity. We are effectively kind of that sort of like slight sort of inspiration porn that comes out of things like the Paralympics, with that kind of, oh, you know, woe is them, but well done them as well. And that's probably something that just in kind of the way we talk and the way we communicate with others, we need to avoid. Next slide. So, how to appeal to disabled talent. Are there people like me that are employed? And are your products accessible? That's all about perception. So thinking about how you use disabled voices in your marketing, in your internal communications, on your LinkedIn, but also, you know, if your products themselves are not accessible, then that can be a real problem. Reality. Will the workplace accommodate my needs? E.g., am I able to work from home? Can I easily access a building? Especially in London, that's something that's often a consideration. I was working fairly recently with a wheelchair user, and she'd originally been given a role during the pandemic, which had meant that her role was remote, and then actually what happened was very, very quickly, as the sort of pandemic kind of eased, she realised that her role involved her having to go basically 3 tube stops away from her workplace, because that was actually the nearest accessible tube station, and then getting a taxi to her place of work, which made it incredibly difficult for her to access work. Recruitment. How easy is it in your recruitment processes to ask for reasonable adjustments? And things like CV gaps. So for me, I have about 12 years working in marketing, and I have 2 quite substantial career gaps that have fallen due to my health, and those are things that actually it's not particularly nice to be asked about. I try and be quite brief when I've previously been in interview situations, but it can be really, really, really challenging as a disabled person to talk about those CV gaps. Do you provide equal access to training and support? And are you open to learning? I think it's very important to be, as genuine and honest as possible. So, I mean, a simple thing in terms of how you might present yourself as an organisation is thinking about sort of the accessibility of the events that you're running. So if, for example, you were running a face-to-face event, think about BSL, think about captioning, think about accessibility needs. One of the things that we do whenever we're running a live event sort of in person is we actually provide an accessibility rider in advance, which is just a very simple document in terms of, will there be access to a quiet space if you're neurodiverse? What will the seating arrangements be like? Is there going to be easy free movement through the building? Is there going to be a ramp? And that's a really good way of just putting somebody absolutely at ease. Next slide. And then in terms of retention, so thinking about providing flexible hours, home and hybrid options. The COVID pandemic was absolutely a game changer for disabled and chronically ill people who had been asking for years and years and years for more flexible ways of working. And actually, in terms of the pandemic, we really proved that that's something that we can do. So take, for example, Facebook and Tesla, who are currently reopening their offices in the Silicon Valley to sort of 40 plus hours a week. Actually, what's really interesting is that there's been a lot of protests within their employees as they've actually proved that they made the businesses more profitable than they've ever been during that period of greater flexibility. There's also that idea of openness, making it as easy as possible, being available to sort of check in at regular basis, offering support, offering opportunities to progress. This is a huge one. So if someone is remote, they are less likely to be promoted. So find ways to engage with remote or hybrid employees, engage them with social events, and also think a bit outside the box when it comes to social events. So for somebody, for example, who maybe suffers with chronic fatigue, being in a space such as a really busy bar can be absolutely exhausting for that person. They may not actually drink due to the fact that they experience chronic fatigue for whatever reason. But actually, by providing sort of less sensory overload with events, that can be a really good way of engaging and diversifying the people that actually engage with your social events. Being open to learning, so from internal and external experts. One of the things I really would emphasize is that your one disabled employee should not be your font of knowledge on disability. Disability comes in many, many, many different forms, but as a whole, it can be incredibly exhausting, and it often does come hand in hand with energy limitations. Remember that person actually wants to do their job. So say, for example, you had a disabled marketing manager. Don't also make them the DEI lead unless they want it, because they want to get their job done and they want to progress in their career in marketing. Most probably they don't necessarily want to progress down that DEI route. Next slide. So here are some quick inclusive marketing wins that we can all make. So image descriptions, they are absolutely vital. They are easy to add in any of your social media, and you should also be adding them onto your website. This is an example of a bad image description. So the image description is a woman in a brown dress with long hair. And the picture that's come up is simply a woman in a brown dress with long hair. However, next slide. This is actually an image description of the Mona Lisa. She is a woman in a brown dress with long hair. but actually it's a painting of a white woman with shoulder-length brown hair in an earthy green and brown dress by Italian artist Leonardo da Vinci, painted oil on canvas in the early 1500s. The painting presents a woman in a half-body portrait, which has a backdrop of a distant landscape. She's looking towards the painter with a slight smile. As you can see, the difference there is quite apparent. Really try and paint a picture in your image descriptions. I know it can feel really laborious. Believe me, it's something that, as somebody with a lot of energy limitations, actually is kind of becomes the bane of my life sometimes. But it is vitally important as a really quick access win, and it's free to do. It takes a couple of extra minutes, and it's vitally important. Next slide. The other thing is using Camel case. So Camel case is basically when the first word of any sentence is a capital letter. So this means that it's readable by a screen reader. So that says this is Camel case. The way a screen reader would read the second one would be absolute gobbledygook. And this basically means that anybody who is visually impaired or is using a screen reader for whatever reason, so for example, somebody with ME might use a screen reader to actually reduce the amount of time they are spending and the amount of energy they're expending to read some information. And also, just as a wider thing, thinking about screen readers, a promotional pop-up can be an absolutely fantastic way to capture email, but it messes with a screen reader. Somebody using a screen reader will just see that promotional pop-up. The screen reader then might actually read some of the words around that pop-up, and it will basically become an absolute mess. It's also worth realizing that nothing that we produce on Canva can be read by a screen reader. So if you're using Canva to produce, for example, a really nice PDF, actually that's not readable. So you would need like a plain text version in order to make that readable by a screen reader. Complex designs also don't help. So for example, even though we try and use InDesign because it's best practice, you know, if you were to create, say, something like a timeline, the screen reader will just absolutely not enjoy that. So again, it's thinking about just copying and pasting that text and providing a plain text version. Next slide. The other thing is captioning, and this shouldn't just be auto captions. So if you can, invest spending some time to add captions as standard, and also make sure that they are actually accurate. I was at an event the other week, which was a major UK bank, and their captioning basically wanted to say the word testicle many times throughout that entire thing, and I'm sure it was incredibly embarrassing for them. They are a major global bank, but it was also really quite hard for people like me that actually use captions quite regularly as a method of concentrating. Next slide. So just to kind of finish off really, some steps you can immediately make to make a difference. So remember that you don't have to be an expert. The most important thing is being a champion for anyone in your organisation who has accessibility needs and helping them by signposting the right information. One of the things that I haven't actually really mentioned, but in terms of the workplace, if somebody's neurodiverse, such as myself, actually having agendas and information shared in advance can be hugely beneficial to somebody who's who you're either working with or is part of your organisation. Think about creating things as a universal design. So for example, there's an amazing fashion designer in London who has a fantastic fashion brand called Unhidden. She's been at London Fashion Week. Definitely do keep an eye out. And actually her designs are all completely accessible. They are fantastic ways of using sustainable fashion for good. But think about that as universal design. Anyone can wear it. It's not just a product for disabled people. Think about creating policies and best practice. So 96% of businesses across the UK have an equality and diversity policy. 4% of those include disability and health. That's something that really needs to change when it represents such a huge proportion of people within the UK. And think about creating supportive networks and also getting buy-in from those senior leaders. And that's really all about championing and signposting again. I think that's my last slide. Yes. Thank you very much for listening. If you would like to kind of find out more about what we do, we're sickofficial.co.uk. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter and LinkedIn. You can also find me on LinkedIn, and please do feel free to reach out to me via email as well.
Lovely, thank you so much, Alice. That was really fascinating to hear you talk about all the different aspects. There is so much to think about, and actually just broadening the horizons and thinking about inclusiveness in terms of a really, really broad range of characteristics and individuals and different needs. Please do, if anyone's got any questions, please do pop them in the chat. I have already prepared a Blue Peter-esque some questions, to be honest, because I know we've got businesses that we work with that have asked these in the past. So Alice, if you're happy for me to rattle through some of these.
Yeah.
I'm going to pick up on a couple of things that you'd actually mentioned as well. But I think there was a really interesting point about energy, and you mentioned people's sort of different energy, particularly if they have some neurodiverse needs. And I'm just wondering about how, especially in a hybrid world, how do we support people to stay connected? So you might well have people who are going into the office or working from home and doing those core hours, the 9 to 5, but then you might also have people who really do need to start a little bit later or need to kind of chunk up their time in different ways. And just wondering about, from a business perspective, how to keep the communication.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with having core hours. I think it's just about contracting those like as much as possible. So rather than saying our core hours are 9 to 5, there's no real benefit there. And actually, if you're thinking about people that potentially have childcare responsibilities, for them those core hours are equally restrictive. So instead maybe think about sort of 10:30 till 3 o'clock are your core hours where there are meetings, and outside of that offer that flexibility. That's kind of a really easy one. I think in terms of as well thinking about energy and as a whole for disabled people, for chronically ill people, for neurodiverse people, think about supporting the person in work that's working with you actually through the access to work process. So that's something that's provided by the government. It's a pretty long, lengthy process, but actually once you get to the top of the pile, it's actually pretty easy. And they will actually come into your workplace and assess the person in your work, and they'll actually be able to provide them with loads of tools and signpost things that you may never have known existed. So for example, I went through that process really, really recently, and a lot of the tools that I was provided with were effectively just ways of making my life a little bit easier. So thinking about dictation software, for example, when I'm particularly low energy, and actually just offering those little bits of support to an employee can make a massive difference.
Lovely, Alice, that's really helpful. Thank you so much. And just thinking about really practical tools, we did have a question come in from Cynthia who's just asked, are there any resources for learning how to write good alt text? So thinking about those images, how do you
Yeah, absolutely. There are loads and loads of resources online. There's some fantastic disabled creators, especially those who are like visually impaired, who have created some brilliant resources online, which basically kind of explains in a little bit more detail, you know, what they see when they hear, for example, like, you know, there's like an example that I've seen, which is like a YouTube video, which is really good, which is basically like a garden, and then it's kind of like a garden with a path, and then it's like a garden with a path with XYZ. And I mean, the thing I would say is, you know, making just a small amount of additional effort will really help you kind of stand out from what other people are doing who completely ignore that those things even exist.
Brilliant, thanks, Alice. And just also to come back to someone else's question, we're going to share the recording, the slides, and we're going to also share the resources that Alice has mentioned during the talk today. So please feel free to sort of, we'll send all that to you in an email to save you having to scribble it all down whilst we're online. Alice, I wanted to come back as well to one other thing that you'd mentioned around that, talking about CV skill, CV gaps, and taking that time off. And I'm just wondering, do you have any suggestions or ideas in terms of from the company's perspective, if they're in an interview process, how they might best approach that kind of question so that people feel comfortable?
I think absolutely, I completely understand that those questions need to be asked. And also one of the things that we do is we really try and help people within their cover letters, within their CVs, to actually kind of know what to say. I would absolutely just, you know, if there is a gap and there's no explicit information, I mean, our advice is often, you know, give a little bit of information and maybe say some of the things that you've kind of been developing on the side of that. But I mean, my thing would be basically don't completely fixate on that as a thing, and also don't fixate on that as an issue. I mean, one thing I would say is that a lot of my career gaps have been more caused by ill health that have been caused by bad employers that have like exacerbated my health. So despite the fact I was shielding during the pandemic, I was told to go into work, and I then got COVID and was then very unwell. And that, of course, didn't make me particularly want to stay at that employer. So, you know, don't also be kind of put off thinking, oh, well, they've had a career gap, they're going to leave us, they're going to be really unreliable. That's absolutely not the case. I mean, one thing I would say about you know, disabled and chronically ill people as a whole is that we tend to be really great problem solvers, because we're kind of constantly facing like adversity at various points. So you know, a good employer can absolutely be a game changer there in terms of our health. And you know, I think even just spending a lunchtime kind of learning about that, like, makes a big difference.
Yeah, I love the point about it coming back to people's lived experience. So no matter who you are and how you structure your life, your lived experience will give you the resources to be resilient and kind of put all that into place for your work. Yeah. Thanks, Alice. I've got a few more questions here for you. I think one of the things that we talk about, or we've talked about previously when we've talked about diversity and inclusion, and thinking about those kind of classic characteristics, is employers and businesses going out to their staff and surveying them and asking people for their data, essentially. And I'm just wondering, I think this is kind of an area perhaps that isn't as well developed as other areas in terms of understanding how people identify. And I'm just wondering about, should businesses be surveying their staff to find out more about, I suppose, their needs, and if you've got any kind of thoughts or ideas or tips about A, if that's a good idea, and B, how you might go about it.
I think it absolutely depends on the way that an organisation uses that information. So, for example, a really good best-in-class example is a previous employer that basically put every single employee on their content management system. And actually what was really good about that is they used that to also collect accessibility issues, allergies, health information, emergency contact details, kind of like all of that. And actually, in terms of practicalities, that was a fantastic way of doing it, because you could download, well, which staff members are going to be working on this event, XYZ. Okay, well, we know this person actually has a really severe allergy to this. We know this person has an access requirement. And it was very much kind of ingrained in the organisation culturally. And I think that was really, really good. I also think sometimes the information that is gathered can be used really beneficially. And I think, 33% of the working age population have a chronic illness or a disability. If you have 10 employees, realistically, there will be employees that fall within that category. And you might just not know that yet. But I think it's about how that information is collected and what it's actually used for. If it's used for the benefits of the employees, I think fantastic. If it's just kind of used and people are worried about, for example, how that might impact their employment status, whether that could sort of come back to bite them in the past. I mean, I think it's almost like when we're going back in time, thinking about sort of, 20 years ago, when it was quite a common question for women to be asked, are you married? Are you planning on having kids in the next however many years? And they're thinking, well, that means I'm not going to get a promotion. That means I'm not going to be progressing. And effectively, it's that sort of same thing in terms of it really needs to be like a reassurance. Some companies in terms of kind of health and diversity, so we've been doing some really interesting work with the gaming industry, which actually 50% of their employees are neurodiverse, which is a very interesting stat. But with regards to that, we've actually been gathering that data. They then don't actually have any kind of thing that could be like personally linked to anybody. But what's been really good is it's then informed, they've then been doing sort of like management training that's really specific about supporting their neurodiverse employees, even if they don't know exactly who they are. Some people will then identify themselves and sort of say who they are. Other people may still not be okay with that diagnosis and that label, and that's also completely fine. But I think it's about really creating that like safe space and also really emphasizing how that information is going to be used.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. I think it really dovetails nicely into kind of the wider kind of talking to employees and gathering information that's going to be ultimately used to support employees, really.
Yeah.
Not just used in terms of KPIs or reporting purposes.
Yeah.
That actually, again, sort of another sort of question that was kind of going through my mind through the presentation was about how do you kind of bring everyone on the journey, because it's not something that's talked about necessarily openly or talked about enough. And just that piece about how do we upskill kind of the wider staff. Potentially, I'm thinking that a survey or some kind of conversation at least kind of kickstarts that process around that wider awareness before you maybe even get to upskilling. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well, it's about thinking about, training shouldn't just be for the leaders within the organisation. That information and that training should really be kind of right across the board. And I think, companies that are really good at staff retention tend to be really good at that learning and development piece, and really kind of include diversity as a whole within that learning and development piece, not just as we've all kind of at some point in our careers probably done that kind of like online diversity training, but instead thinking about really interesting ways of doing it. So we actually ran a really cool like lunch and learn style thing, which was actually a book club at a startup in London, and that was kind of open to all their employees. It was like they all got sort of like lunch, and it was very much kind of you know, quite a fun social activity, but actually, you know, the core book was written by a disabled woman about her experience as of being a disabled person in London. And you know, it was kind of talking about that like millennial experience and that disabled experience at the same time. And there are some really cool ways that you can be a bit more creative about it.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Yeah, I was just creativity was the key word I sort of drew out there, and I was thinking, you know, there are also sort of awareness days and things, but these could all be linked into kind of broader initiatives that go on across the organization. I love the idea of a film club or a book club or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's sort of kind of coming to the end of my questions. Please feel free, anyone, if you've got any last minute questions. What I think I'll do is just, I've got some additional kind of resources that I'd like to point out to people coming along today, which might be free for some people. So Alice, thank you. I just want to say a huge thank you to you and sort of sharing your expertise and also sharing your experiences and your personal story with us. I think it's been incredibly helpful and really brought to kind of life the kind of pain points that businesses can really help address in terms of recruiting and then engaging their staff, as well as that purple pound. So thank you very much.
No, thank you. Thanks everyone for listening. And yeah, as I said, you know, do feel free to reach out to me. I'm also going to share with Louise and Heart of the City a link, because we do run these sort of short one-to-one access and inclusion clinics. If anybody ever has anything that they need to kind of bring up and chat about, they're sort of free to access, just sort of little 30-minute drop-in sessions. So yeah, thanks very much everyone for listening.
Thank you, Alice. Right, so I also mentioned a few resources from Heart of the City as well. So I just want to signpost these to you in the room. If you're not aware of them, they might be of interest. Heart of the City run two programs for businesses. We have our Foundations for Responsible Business. So Foundations looks at those three pillars that I mentioned at the start of the presentation: people, place and planet, and how do businesses work along those lines to build out their responsible business practices. It's an online program. We're going to be hosting more in-person events in 2023. You get provided with an account manager. You'll do a responsible business health check. There are workshops, access to ambassadors and expertise, and we'll help you first of all write a strategy and then also put that strategy in place for your business. If your business is in Hackney, Islington, Camden, Southwark or Lambeth, you are eligible for a fully funded place as well. If you are a business based in the City of London, we are working with the City of London Corporation to provide free net zero training as well. So this course is all about sort of jargon busting, then getting you to measure your carbon footprint, taking all that data, and we'll support you to get that data and then making an action plan from that you can start working on your net zero targets. If you're outside of the City of London, we have a free climate action toolkit, which essentially is a DIY approach. You can download the toolkit and work your way through that so that you end up with an action plan and a net zero target to work towards as well. So please do access those. We will be sharing these in the thank you email that will come next week with all the resources from today as well. So we're out of time now. I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone for coming along today, for spending your lunch with us. Massive thanks again to Alice for all her expertise in this area. We really hope that you found some useful tips, some ideas, something to be thought-provoking to take back to your businesses and really think about accessibility and inclusion in a different or a new or inspiring way. So thank you very much for attending today, everyone.